The storm raged like a beast outside the palace walls, the wind howling through the shattered remains of a once proud kingdom. Lightning split the sky, casting violent shadows across the towering marble pillars of the throne room. The scent of rain, blood, and smoke lingered in the air, a bitter reminder of the war that had led to this moment. She stood in the center of the vast chamber, her body aching from battle, her breath ragged, but her spirit unbroken. Torn fabric clung to her skin, stained with the remnants of her fight. The golden insignia on her chest, the last symbol of the land she had sworn to protect, was tarnished with blood, her own and that of those who had fallen beside her. Before her, seated on the throne that once belonged to her ancestors, was the man who had taken everything from her. He was composed, unaffected by the destruction that surrounded them. The black and gold of his attire shimmered under the flickering candlelight, a stark contrast to the cold steel of his gaze. His presence filled the room, commanding, suffocating. There was no urgency in his movements, no hesitation in his words, only the quiet confidence of a ruler who knew the game was already won. His lips curled into a faint smirk. "Surrender!" His voice was smooth, patient, as if he were speaking to a foolish child who had yet to realize the inevitability of her fate. "Kneel before me, and I will grant you everything you have ever desired." The words echoed in the hollow space between them, wrapping around her like invisible chains. Everything! A life without fear, without suffering, without war. She could end it all right now. No more battles, no more bloodshed, no more waking up each day knowing that she was fighting a losing war. Her people had turned against her. Her allies had abandoned her. Those who once called her their protector had long since whispered of her failure. And yet, despite the weight pressing down upon her, she had never once faltered. Until now, his offer slithered into the cracks of her resolve. The temptation was undeniable. A single word, a single act of submission, and she would no longer have to bear the burden of being the last line of defense for a kingdom that had forsaken her. His eyes studied her carefully, catching the flicker of hesitation she so desperately tried to suppress. "You would be safe," he murmured, his voice as soft as silk yet laced with iron. "You would be powerful. You would never have to fight again." Her fingers twitched. Would surrender truly be so terrible? Would it be weakness or simply survival? She swallowed, her throat dry. He had taken everything from her, her people, her home, her freedom. And now, he was offering her the one thing she had never had: security. A life where she was not constantly looking over her shoulder. A future where she was not hunted like an animal, where she did not wake to the screams of the fallen ringing in her ears. The war had carved a hollow space in her chest, and he was offering to fill it. "All you have to do," he whispered, stepping down from the throne, closing the distance between them inch by inch, "is say yes." The weight of the moment crushed down upon her. She was alone. No one would blame her for choosing the path of least resistance. No one would call her a coward for choosing to live instead of dying for a lost cause. But then, what would remain of her? She clenched her jaw, lifting her gaze to meet his. His smirk remained, but there was something else in his expression now. Curiosity, amusement, a sliver of something that almost resembled admiration. She knew that if she faltered now, if she bent the knee before him, she would never rise again. Her soul would not survive it. She took a breath. She made her choice. And then, the throne room doors burst open. A dozen soldiers stormed inside, swords drawn, their faces unreadable beneath their helmets. She did not know whether they had come to execute her or drag her to the dungeons, but it did not matter. The moment was over. The offer had been made, and she had answered. The moment her lips parted, sealing her fate, she knew there would be no mercy. A single word had been enough. No? The weight of her defiance hung in the air, thick with unspoken consequences. For a moment, silence reigned in the throne room, the storm outside a mere whisper compared to the tension crackling between them. The soldiers who had entered stood frozen, awaiting their ruler's command. But he did not react immediately. He simply looked at her, studied her, as if trying to understand what kind of fool would choose pain over power, suffering over safety. Then he sighed, not in anger, not in disappointment, but in something that almost felt like amusement. You truly are insufferable. She barely had time to process his words before the first soldier struck. A crushing blow to the back of her legs sent her collapsing to the marble floor. Her arms were wrenched behind her, rough hands binding her wrists in heavy iron. She did not resist. Resistance would be meaningless now. Her fate had been decided the moment she refused him. Boots scraped against the stone as he stepped toward her, his shadow falling over her like an executioner's blade. He crouched down, lifting her chin with 2 fingers, forcing her to meet his gaze. "Do you know what I admire most about you?" he murmured, his tone far too calm. "Your stupidity." She didn't flinch. Even now, staring into the eyes of the man who held her life in his hands, she refused to break. His lips curled into a smirk. "Take her!" The soldiers obeyed instantly, dragging her across the throne room floor. Her knees scraped against the cold stone, but she made no sound. She would not give him the satisfaction. As they reached the massive iron doors, she heard him call out once more, his voice carrying through the chamber like a final verdict. "I hope you enjoy the darkness." Then the doors slammed shut behind her, and the real suffering began. They did not kill her. Perhaps death would have been a mercy too quickly granted. Instead, they threw her into the dungeons, into a place where light did not exist and time had no meaning. The air was damp, thick with the stench of blood and rot. Shackles tightened around her wrists and ankles, their cold bite digging into her skin. She could endure this. She had endured worse, or so she thought. Days passed, or perhaps weeks. Sleep came and went in brief, feverish moments, broken by the relentless torment of her captors. They came not with questions, not seeking information, but simply to remind her of what defiance cost. The beatings, the starvation, those were expected. She had prepared herself for physical pain, but the worst was the silence. No voices, no light, no sense of the world beyond these stone walls. She was alone with nothing but her thoughts, the crushing weight of isolation pressing down on her more than any chain ever could. She did not break, not even when her body begged for rest, not even when her lips cracked from dehydration, not even when her bones ached with the promise of never healing. But then, the moment that would haunt her forever came. They dragged her from her cell, her legs too weak to carry her, forcing her to kneel in the center of a dimly lit chamber. A single brazier flickered in the corner, casting elongated shadows against the walls. And then he entered. She felt his presence before she saw him, an aura of control that suffocated everything in its reach. He knelt before her, his fingers brushing against her cheek, a mockery of tenderness. "Still so stubborn," he murmured. "You should have chosen differently." Her lips curled into a weak, defiant smirk. "And miss all this?" His chuckle was dark, humorless. "Then let me give you something to truly remember." That was when she felt the cold metal press against her skin. It happened so quickly, so cruelly, that she barely had time to react before searing pain exploded behind her eyes. She screamed. And then, there was only darkness. She woke to a world she could no longer see. The agony was indescribable, but worse than the pain was the realization. The realization that she would never again witness the sunrise over her homeland. Never again see the faces of the people she had sworn to protect. Never again look her enemy in the eyes. They had taken her sight, and yet, even as she lay in the abyss of her suffering, one thought remained. If I had the chance, I would do it all differently. Her fingers curled into the cold stone beneath her, a silent vow forming in the depths of her ruined world. If I could turn back time, I would not lose. And as if fate itself had been waiting for those very words, the world trembled. The air around her cracked, reality twisting like glass shattering in slow motion. And then, she opened her eyes, not to the darkness of her prison, but to a past she thought had been lost forever. She gasped, her body lurching upright, her heart hammering violently against her ribs. Light. She could see. The ceiling above her was not the damp, crumbling stone of her prison. It was smooth, untouched by war. The air smelled of morning dew, not of blood and decay. Her fingers trembled as she reached up, pressing against her face. No bandages, no pain. Her vision was clear. She scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in sharp gasps. This wasn't the dungeon. This wasn't the darkness where she had suffered. This was... She turned sharply, her gaze landing on the ornate mirror across the room. A girl stared back at her, wide-eyed and shaken. Her. But not her. Her skin wasn't pale from malnourishment. Her body wasn't covered in bruises and scars. Her hair, once tangled and filthy in the depths of imprisonment, was neatly tied back. She stepped closer, her fingers brushing against the mirror's surface, as if the reflection might shatter under her touch. The face that looked back at her was younger. This was impossible. Her heart pounded. The last thing she remembered was the darkness, the pain, the suffocating despair, the crushing realization that she had lost everything. She had begged the universe for another chance, a chance to do things differently. And now, she sucked in a sharp breath. This was not her present. This was 10 years ago. Her legs nearly gave out beneath her, but she forced herself to stay upright. She knew this room, her chamber in the royal palace. It had been hers before the war, before her kingdom had crumbled, before she had made the choices that had led to her downfall. This was real. Somehow, impossibly, she had been sent back. Her mind raced. If she was here, if this was truly the past, then nothing had happened yet. The war hadn't begun. Her people hadn't turned against her. And he, her stomach twisted, the ruthless ruler who had destroyed her world, the man who had stood above her as she lost everything, the man who had taken her sight, her freedom, her very existence. He had not yet conquered her kingdom. Not yet. Her breaths came shallow, uneven. The memories of her suffering burned in the back of her mind, the pain of betrayal, the agony of her final days. This was her chance to change everything. But how? Her first instinct was to warn her people, to prepare them for the inevitable war, to fight. But she had fought before. She had resisted. She had stood her ground, and she had lost everything. She clenched her fists. No, this time she wouldn't fight him. She would join him. The very thought sent chills down her spine. But the logic was undeniable. She had seen the future. She knew exactly how things would unfold. The alliances that would crumble. The betrayals that would come. The war that would tear everything apart. She had fought for her kingdom before, and it had abandoned her. This time, she would not be its pawn. If she wanted to survive, if she wanted to win, she needed to stand beside him, not against him. The idea was madness, but she had no choice. She would seek out the man she once called an enemy, and this time, she would make him believe that she was on his side. She had thought walking toward her enemy would be the hardest thing she had ever done. She was wrong. The hardest part was pretending. Pretending she didn't already know how this story ended. Pretending she didn't remember the way he had stood over her broken body, the way his voice had curled around every word like a promise of destruction. Pretending she wasn't afraid. But fear would do nothing for her now. If she wanted to change her fate, she needed to be someone else. The palace corridors stretched endlessly before her, untouched by war, by fire, by the devastation that had once stolen everything from her. This was before blood had tainted these walls, before betrayal had whispered through the halls like a ghost. She knew exactly where to go. The warlord had not yet taken her kingdom, but he was already here, already circling like a vulture, waiting for the inevitable collapse. He had come under the pretense of diplomacy, a false peace offering between two nations standing on the edge of war. She knew how this meeting had played out before. She had been defiant, righteous, furious. She had called him a tyrant, refused his proposal of alliance, and sent him away in disgrace. And it had sealed her fate, because in doing so, she had not only rejected him, she had provoked him. She had given him a reason to make an example of her. Not this time. She reached the massive doors of the royal council chamber, her pulse hammering against her skin. The guards flanking the entrance shifted uneasily as she approached. They knew her. They knew she was not supposed to be here. She lifted her chin. Let me through. The hesitation was brief, but it was there. A flicker of doubt. Then, the princess is not to enter. The voice came from within the chamber. Deep, commanding, his voice. A shiver ran through her, unbidden, but she held her ground. And yet, here I am. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then, let her in. The doors groaned as they swung open, revealing the dimly lit council chamber. She stepped inside, her eyes locking onto him. He had not changed, not yet. This was not the warlord she had come to fear. Not the man who had carved his empire from the ruins of fallen nations. No, this was the man before all of that. He stood at the far end of the chamber, arms folded across his chest, watching her with careful interest. Dark hair, sharp features, a gaze that missed nothing. He was tall, imposing, every inch of him a threat even in stillness. And yet, there was no cruelty in his expression. Not yet. She had been so used to seeing him as the monster that she had almost forgotten he had once been human. The councilman watched in stunned silence as she strode forward, stopping just a few feet from him. He raised an eyebrow. "This is unexpected." She inhaled sharply. She needed to be careful. One wrong step, one misplaced word, and she would lose everything before she even had the chance to begin. "I wish to speak with you, alone." Murmurs broke out around the chamber. The councilmen looked at one another in shock. The princess, who had sworn to stand against him, who had rejected his every proposal, was now asking for a private audience? His gaze sharpened. "Is that so?" She did not falter. "Yes." For a moment he said nothing. Then, with the barest tilt of his head, he dismissed the room. The councilmen hesitated, but no one dared question him. One by one, they filed out until only the two of them remained. The heavy doors shut behind them. Silence. Then, "Well?" he mused, stepping closer. "I'm listening." Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. This was it. The moment that would decide everything. She lifted her chin, met his gaze, and spoke the words that would change both of their fates forever. "I want to join you." For a moment, the room was suffocatingly still. He did not react. Not immediately. He simply stared at her, his gaze sharp enough to slice through her resolve. The warlord was not a man who trusted easily. He was not a man who forgave betrayal, and she had been his enemy. "You want to join me?" His voice was quiet, but there was something dangerous beneath it. She did not waver. "Yes." A beat of silence. "Then," he laughed. It was not a sound of amusement, nor one of disbelief. It was something else. Something darker. "I see." His gaze raked over her, calculating, dissecting. "And why should I believe you?" Of course, he would not accept her words at face value. She had spent years standing against him, spitting in the face of his every offer, resisting him until the bitter end. And now, she came to him, claiming allegiance? She had prepared for this. "Because I have seen the future," she said. He went still. "I know how this war ends. I know every move my kingdom will make. I know the betrayals that are coming, the alliances that will crumble. And I know that if I stay on their side, I will lose." She took a step forward, her voice steady. "But if I stand with you, I can help you win." Something flickered across his expression, too quick to read. He studied her, silent and unreadable. Then he spoke. "You expect me to believe you have seen the future?" "No," she admitted. "I expect you to use me." That made him pause. She pressed on before he could speak. "If you think I'm lying, then you lose nothing by keeping me close. But if I'm telling the truth, then you have something invaluable, knowledge of your enemy." A slow smirk curled at the edges of his lips. "You are either the most desperate woman I've ever met, or the most dangerous." She did not flinch. "Perhaps both." The room felt too small, the air too thick with tension. Then finally he moved. He stepped closer, slow and deliberate, until they were mere inches apart. His presence was suffocating, his gaze a storm she could not escape. "If you betray me," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet menace, "I will not grant you mercy." She already knew that. She had seen the mercy he gave to traitors. She met his gaze head on, unshaken. "Then I suppose we will have to see who betrays whom first." His eyes darkened, something unreadable flashing across them. Then, slowly, he lifted a hand. "Kneel!" Her heart pounded. This was it. This was the moment where she chose. To bend the knee to the man who had once destroyed her. To step onto a path that had no return. She dropped to one knee and sealed her fate. She had thought she was prepared for what came next. She was wrong. Walking the halls of his stronghold, surrounded by his soldiers, his advisors, his people, was like stepping into a nightmare she had once lived through. Every face she passed, every voice she heard, they were all people who had once hunted her, tortured her, celebrated her downfall. And now she was one of them. She walked beside him, his presence an unshakable force at her side. The people around them stared, some with curiosity, some with thinly veiled hostility. None of them trusted her, and she did not trust them. As they walked, he spoke without looking at her. You do realize that everyone here expects you to betray me. Good, she said, keeping her voice even. Let them. It will make it easier to move when they least expect it. He let out a quiet chuckle. You enjoy playing with fire, don't you? She turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze. It seems I'm not the only one. His expression remained unreadable, but something about it sent a chill down her spine. She had stepped into the den of a beast, and now she had to survive it. As they reached the main hall, a voice cut through the tense air. Why is she here? She turned to see a man step forward. One of his generals. Someone she remembered all too well. In the past, he had been one of the first to lead the charge against her, one of the first to stand over her broken body as they had taken everything away. His gaze was filled with barely concealed contempt. This woman is our enemy. You can't seriously expect us to trust her. The warlord did not look at him. That is not your decision to make. The general bristled. My lord, she has fought against us for years. And now she fights for us. Silence. The general's jaw tightened, but he said nothing more. She knew this was only the beginning. No one trusted her. No one wanted her here. And if she made a single mistake, they would tear her apart. But she would not let them, because she had already lived through the worst, and she refused to lose again. At first, she thought it was just strategy. She had walked into this alliance, knowing that trust would never come easily. Every day in the enemy stronghold was a battle of survival, not with swords or bloodshed, but with whispered conversations, veiled threats, and the ever-present watchful eyes of those who wanted her gone. No one believed her loyalty was real, not even him, but he was intrigued by her. She could see it in the way he studied her when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way he tested her. His words sharp, his challenges relentless. She was supposed to be just another piece on the board, another pawn in a war she was trying to rewrite. So why did she feel like he was playing an entirely different game? It started with small things. A single glance across the war room when she pointed out a strategy that no one else had considered. A flicker of amusement when she bested one of his commanders in a verbal spar. The slight tilt of his head when she questioned his decisions, as if he enjoyed the challenge. She knew who he was. She had lived the consequences of his actions, had suffered under the weight of his victory. He was ruthless, cunning, dangerous. And yet, he was not the monster she had imagined. In her past life, she had only ever seen him as the enemy, the warlord who destroyed her home, the conqueror who had taken everything. She had never stopped to look beyond that, never stopped to see the man beneath the legend. But now she walked beside him. She saw the exhaustion in his eyes after long war councils, saw the flickers of emotion he buried beneath his cold exterior, saw the way his grip tightened on the hilt of his sword when old wounds were mentioned, as if he, too, carried ghosts that refused to let him go. She saw the loneliness, and it terrified her, because it was the same loneliness that haunted her. One evening, she found herself alone in the strategy room with him, long after the others had left. Maps lay sprawled across the table, ink staining her fingers as she traced the lines of borders she once swore to protect. You're still here! His voice broke the silence. She didn't look up. So are you? A pause, then. You didn't eat. That made her glance at him. He leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, watching her with a gaze that saw too much. Neither did you. A small smirk ghosted across his lips. You keep track of my meals now? She scoffed. Hard not to when you intimidate the servants into silence every time they try to remind you. He let out a quiet chuckle, but there was something in his expression that unsettled her. A strange kind of curiosity, as if she had surprised him yet again. You're different, he murmured. Her pulse quickened. You think so? She asked, feigning indifference. His gaze never left her. Yes. You were fire before, untamed, reckless. But now, you burn with purpose. She swallowed. He was right. The girl he had once faced in battle had been fueled by passion, by blind faith in a kingdom that had abandoned her. That girl had fought with everything and lost. This version of her, The woman standing before him now was something else entirely, and he saw it. The weight of his attention pressed against her skin, and for the first time, she felt truly seen, not as a fallen princess, not as an enemy, but as someone who had survived. The realization struck her harder than any battle ever had. She had set out on this path for revenge, for control, for a second chance. But somewhere along the way, she had stopped seeing him as just an obstacle. Somewhere along the way, she had begun to understand him. And worse, somewhere along the way, he had begun to understand her too. She had told herself it was all a game, a dangerous, calculated game, where every move was meant to bring her closer to victory. She had chosen this path not for loyalty, not for redemption, but for control. And yet, she could feel herself slipping. Each day beside him chipped away at the lines she had so carefully drawn. Each conversation, each unspoken glance, each moment of shared silence. They were unraveling her. He was not supposed to be anything more than a means to an end. So why did she find herself searching for him in crowded halls? Why did her heart pound when his gaze lingered just a second too long? Why did she feel this quiet, aching pull whenever he was near? It was a mistake, a fatal one. Because if she fell now, if she let herself forget what he had done, what he would do, she would be lost. She could not afford to lose herself. Not again. The night was quiet, the moon casting silver light across the stone corridors of the fortress. She should have been asleep, but sleep never came easily anymore. The weight of her choices pressed heavy on her chest. She had spent years hating him. She had sworn to destroy him. So why did it feel like she was betraying herself now? The door creaked open before she could gather her thoughts. She knew who it was before she turned. Him. He stood in the doorway, dressed in dark robes, his presence as suffocating as ever. But tonight, there was no armor of war, no sharp words meant to cut her down. Just him. "You're awake," he observed. "So are you," she murmured. He stepped inside, the door shutting softly behind him. The air between them was heavy, charged with something she didn't dare name. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, "Tell me the truth," he said. She tensed. "About what?" His gaze was piercing. "Why did you come to me?" The question sent ice through her veins. She had expected it. Of course, he would ask. He was no fool. He had spent years ruling through cunning and calculation. He did not trust easily, and she was the last person in the world who deserved his trust. She could lie. She should lie. But the words caught in her throat. Because part of her didn't know the answer anymore. Was it only revenge? Only survival? Only strategy? Or had she begun to believe in something else? His eyes searched hers, waiting. Say something. But she couldn't. For the first time since stepping into this world again, she didn't know what to say. He exhaled, something unreadable flickering across his expression. "You don't have to answer tonight," he murmured. "But soon, you will have to decide where you truly stand." Then he was gone, leaving her alone with the war raging inside her. And for the first time, she wasn't sure which side she wanted to win. She had once thought that nothing could shake her more than standing beside him. She was wrong. The moment she stepped onto the battlefield, the past crashed into her like a blade to the chest. The banners of her former kingdom still flew high in the distance, their colors vibrant against the blood-stained sky. She had worn that crest once. She had bled for it, had fought for it, had died for it. And now she stood on the opposite side. A traitor. The word burned in her mind, even as she told herself that this was the only way. That she was here to win, to rewrite history. But as she looked across the field and saw them, the people who had once called her their own, their expressions filled not with recognition, but with betrayal. The certainty she had held onto for so long began to fracture. They did not see her as their fallen princess. They saw her as the enemy. The first arrow flew. The battle erupted in a frenzy of steel and smoke, bodies clashing in a violent symphony of war. She moved instinctively, cutting down soldiers she had once trained alongside, dodging attacks from warriors who had once stood at her side. Her hands were steady, but her heart was unraveling. Was this really the only way? Could she still pretend this was nothing more than a strategy? She barely had time to process the chaos before a voice cut through the battlefield, sharp and familiar. "You!" She turned and the world seemed to freeze. One of her former commanders stood a few feet away, his blade clenched in his hands. his face twisted in fury and disbelief. He had been there in her past life, one of the few who had remained loyal to her until the end, who had fought to protect her even as everything crumbled around them. And now, he looked at her like she was the very thing he had sworn to destroy. "You betrayed us." The words sliced deeper than any blade could. She had prepared for this moment. She had told herself that she could face them, that she would not hesitate when the time came. But she had not prepared for this. The hatred in his eyes, the way the others stopped fighting just to stare at her, the way it felt like she was truly, irreversibly alone. She could hear his footsteps approaching before she even turned. Him, the warlord, the man who had brought her into this life, who had stood beside her as she carved a new path. He stopped at her side, his presence a wall between her and the soldiers who had once been hers. He did not speak, but he didn't need to. His stance said everything. She is mine. She knew what would happen next. He would give the order. His soldiers would strike, cut them down before they could raise their swords again. She had seen it before, but this time she was the reason for it. Her breath caught in her throat. This isn't how it was supposed to be. For so long, she had told herself that this was the only way to win, that if she played her role well enough, she could control the future. But had she ever really been in control? Or had she simply been walking down another path toward her own destruction? Her former commander's eyes locked onto hers, and in that moment she saw his pain, his disbelief, his heartbreak, and she realized something. She had changed the past, but she had not escaped it. She had simply become something else, something caught between the person she used to be and the person she could no longer recognize. The rain came down hard that night, drumming against the stone rooftops like a war cry turned elegy. She stood alone beneath the dark sky, her cloak soaked through, her heart heavier than the storm above. The battle had ended hours ago. The dead had been counted. The wounded were being tended to. And she had disappeared into the shadows, unable to bear the weight in the eyes of those who once loved her. They had seen her now, not as a savior, not as a martyr, but as a traitor. She could still hear their voices, still see the disbelief, the betrayal etched into every face. They had not understood her choices. They never would. And maybe she didn't either. What had begun as a desperate strategy now felt like a path she could no longer turn back from, not because she was trapped, but because of him. She didn't hear his footsteps, but she knew he was there. He always knew where to find her. She didn't turn as he stepped beside her, the silence stretching long between them. For a moment, there were no titles, no ranks, no war. Just the sound of rain and the thundering silence of everything they couldn't say. Then, finally, he spoke. "You were crying." She stiffened. "No, I wasn't." A pause. Then a quiet, bitter smile in his voice. "Then maybe I was." That made her look at him. He wasn't wearing armor tonight. No sword, no crown. Just a man, standing in the rain, looking at her like she was the only truth in a world full of lies. And it undid her. All the walls she had built, all the masks she had worn, all the fire she had held onto, they shattered. "Why me?" she whispered. Her voice was hoarse, like it had carried too many secrets for too long. He didn't ask what she meant. He already knew. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because even when you stood against me, you were never like the rest of them." She blinked, unsure if she was hearing him right. "You burned," he said quietly. "You burned with conviction, with anger, with grief. But you were never empty. You were alive, even when you were my enemy." Her throat tightened. He stepped closer. "And now, you're beside me. You think I haven't questioned it? You think I haven't wondered if this is all just another trap?" She looked down. She couldn't answer that. He gently lifted her chin, forcing her to meet his gaze. "But even if it is, I don't care anymore." Her breath caught. He wasn't the same man from her past, the cold warlord who had torn her world apart. He was still dangerous, still ruthless, but something had changed. He had changed. Or maybe they both had. He leaned in slowly, and when their foreheads touched, she realized she was trembling, not from fear, but from the truth. She had tried to hate him. She had tried to resist this pull between them. But now she knew. She had never truly been able to, because beneath everything, behind all the blood and betrayal, all the broken vows and rewritten fate, he had always seen her, and she had begun to see him too. not as a monster, not as a means to an end, but as the one person in this fractured world who understood what it meant to lose everything and keep going anyway. Their lips met like a final surrender, not to war, not to strategy, but to the truth they could no longer deny. It was not gentle, it was not sweet. It was full of scars and sharp edges and unspoken pain, but it was real. And in a world built on ruin, that was the only thing left worth clinging to. A love that defied everything, even fate. The dawn broke over the horizon, its golden light spilling across the battlefield where war had once raged, where her past had burned to ash, where she had once lost everything. But this time, she was not standing in ruins. This time, she had changed the ending. She stood at the highest tower of the fortress, the wind tugging at her cloak, the scent of rain and steel still lingering in the air. The war that had once destroyed her kingdom, her very existence, was over. And she had won, not through mindless resistance, not through blind loyalty to a kingdom that had abandoned her. She had won because she had dared to rewrite her own fate. Below, the remnants of two armies stood together, not as enemies, but as something entirely new. Her former kingdom had fallen, not in fire, not in blood, but in something far more powerful, a choice. She had given them a future free from the chains of a war that had been doomed to repeat itself. Not everyone accepted it, not everyone forgave her, but she was no longer trying to be their hero. She had chosen herself, and standing beside her, watching the sunrise as if it, too, had been waiting for this moment, was him, the warlord, the man who had once been her greatest enemy, the man she had fought against, had feared, had hated, until she had seen him for what he truly was. Not a monster, not a conqueror, but a survivor, just like her. His voice broke the silence. "You did it!" She turned, meeting his gaze. "No, we did." Something flickered in his eyes, something softer than she had ever thought possible. A smirk tugged at his lips. "You're not going to kneel, are you?" She laughed, the sound surprising even herself. "Never." He let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. "Good." For a long moment, they simply stood there. Two souls who had walked through fire and emerged together. Once, they had been enemies. Once, they had been nothing more than two forces destined to destroy each other. But fate had underestimated them. Because they had rewritten fate itself. She took a deep breath, looking at the world before them. A world no longer bound by the past. A world they would build together. And for the first time in both of their lives, the future belonged to them.